Now what? This is really part 4 of our series, Integrating Our Past. Have you ever felt a conflict between your values and an opportunity in life? Have you ever felt the tradition which formed you would not approve of the direction you were heading in life? You probably felt that way a lot during your teenage years, maybe a little in your college years. You may have felt pulled in 2 different directions, or you simply rejected the old tradition as out of touch or simply wrong. Now, the last presentation, I discussed how our past, what we have been and how we have identified ourselves, can sometimes hold us back to moving in a new direction. I want to pull a both and on you this morning by discussing the importance of not rejecting the past, but learning how to take the best of it with us into our future. In the museums I recently visited, there were some spectacular examples of technical artistry from the 18th and 19th century. Works of real beauty and displaying the highest level of artistic skill. And yet I continually found my eyes drawn more often to works like this. And works like these. Such works of this style are often classified as folk art. The artists are often self-trained. American folk art appeals to me for some reason. I guess it's because it often reflects values that I hold, such as simplicity and appreciation of the natural world that we have to interact with on a daily basis. Folk art depicts stories and ideas important to a particular culture. It was this particular folk artist that you're seeing now that drew most of my attention during my recent tour of art museums. This is an actual picture I took, so let me expand it for you. This is a work by early 19th century artist Edward Hicks. It depicts the story of Noah's Ark, where civilization was saved through one family who brought 2 of every animal species along with them. Many modern educated folks like us see this as merely a child's tale, a myth. This painting does take me back to my childhood and the stories I heard as a child. Now, I know I'm not alone enjoying the charms of simple farm life. Edward Hicks is a very unique person among American artists because he was a Quaker. If any of you know much about the Quakers, you might think Quaker and painter are a contradiction in terms. It is true, the Quakers believed in a life of simplicity, and the arts were seen as a luxury. Have you ever heard of the Quaker music tradition? Any Quaker novelists or filmmakers? Neither have I. Now, I'm sure there are some out there, but like Edward Hicks, they are the rare exception to the rule. Let me start with a little biography on Hicks. Hicks was born in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, in the spring of 1780 to an Anglican family. His parents were loyalists to the English government and lost their income after the defeat of the British in the Revolutionary War. His mother died when he was only 18 months, and he was given to a friend of his mother's who raised him in the Quaker tradition and in its teachings. He was apprenticed at the age of 13 to a sign painter. Signs, as in the type of signs businesses would hang outside their shops or offices, or the kinds of signs you see on the side of carriages when that was the chief mode of transportation. At the age of 23, he was accepted into the Society of Friends, the official name of the Quaker community. And not long after, he married a Quaker woman, Sarah Worstall. And by 1812, he had become a Quaker minister. So he is fully devoted to the Quaker way of life. Well, almost. He also felt called to express his painting skills in a more creative way. than mere signage. Now, one thing about Quaker communities at this time, they didn't pay their ministers. So Hicks relied on his commercial painting as his sole income. And that meant expanding his trade beyond painting signs to painting furniture, farm equipment, and other household objects decoratively. Decoratively didn't go over so well with the Quaker community. Around this time, Hicks started painting wall pictures. He did not sell any of these wall paintings in order to avoid a moral conflict with Quaker teaching, more to avoid a rift with his fellow Quakers. And so he gave them to family and friends. Look at this painting. I think it is the simplicity of style and perfect alignment with the simplicity of subject matter and values expressed in such art that are so appealing to so many. I want to focus on a series of artworks that Hicks produced from the 1820s to the 1840s and up until his death in 1849. He did around 65 or so paintings that he titled The Peaceable Kingdom. 62 are still in existence, and you see one version here. The title comes from a biblical verse, Isaiah 11, 6 through 9. Now let me read that passage while you examine the painting. The wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's den. They shall not hurt or destroy in my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So you can see this is an idealized vision of the time when the Messiah, a root from the lineage of Jesse, shall bring his peaceable kingdom to earth. Now notice on the left of this painting, those colonists with Native Americans. That is the Quaker and founder of Pennsylvania, William Penn, making a treaty with the Lenape Indians. For Hicks, William Penn fully embodied the Quaker values of equality of all peoples and the desire to live at peace with all of one's neighbors. By combining these two scenes, he is indicating that William Penn's respectful treatment toward the Native Americans indicated that the peaceable kingdom was not some pipe dream of the future, but could be realized in the present. Now notice the two children at the bottom in that ravine. I'm going to discuss them in the next slide. This version, created in the early 1830s, is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection, which I saw recently. It reveals something else happening in Hicks' life at the time. Do you see that chasm on the left between the two children and the animals and the child on the right? During the 1820s, a severe disagreement and eventual split occurred among the Quakers. And Edward Hicks's brother, Elias Hicks, was at the center of the schism. And so it is known in history as the Hicksite controversy. Elias was one of the earliest abolitionists and was instrumental in getting all the Quakers to abolish slavery in their community and then work toward its abolition in society as a whole. He was instrumental in getting New York to abolish slavery in 1827. Even though the Bible seems to have accepted the reality of slavery, as did every religion and every culture up until that time, Elias believed that the Spirit was sending a clear message of condemnation of the practice and calling all Christians to work for its abolition. Other Quakers thought slavery, though not a moral ideal, was not a controversy to get involved with because the Bible was ambivalent about it. To put it more broadly, Elias and his followers took a more liberal and progressive stance, promoting the idea of progressive revelation. They believed God didn't just speak once way back in biblical times, but continues to speak through inspired individuals. So for the liberal Quakers, revelation was an ongoing and an ever-expanding phenomenon, and thus the inner spirit within the believer was the final authority on matters of faith and morality. The more conservative Quakers believed the Bible was the final authority. These children you see on the left represent the split between the two factions of Quakers. In this version, we see that the children have either fallen into the chasm or have tried to traverse it to reach the other child. Edward Hicks, though he sided with his brother theologically, was saddened by the division amongst his beloved religious community. He expressed this regret, and particularly his longing for peaceful reconciliation, through his art. In this work, it's as if the children represent his desire to get to the other side of the peaceable kingdom, where all would be well again. I apologize, this version of Peaceable Kingdom isn't larger, but it was taken by me at a special exhibit at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond, Virginia. Notice the geological formation on the left side of the painting. That is Natural Bridge. It isn't located in Pennsylvania where Hicks lived, but in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. It was one of the most popular tourist destinations in the 18th and 19th centuries. For Hicks, it symbolizes the majesty and grace of God. This version with the Natural Bridge, located in the Reynolda House Museum of American Art in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, gives a better perspective. Now, it's a bit strange to see a particular geographical landmark in America dropped into an imaginative scene of future peace. This reveals the creative side of Hicks. He is not limited to any one particular subject or narrative, but feels free to combine ideas through visual symbols. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Notice this tiny scene under the Natural Bridge. It's hard to see in the previous picture. It is William Penn making his treaty. In this version in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., we see that the children have almost made it up out of the ravine. Hicks is obviously very hopeful there could be peace between the two sides, even though there are still significant disagreements. He is hoping, I believe, that the mutual values of peace and love could bridge the gap between the two factions. Edward Hicks could have condemned the Orthodox Quakers as just a bunch of small-minded Bible thumpers. But his art reveals an entirely different attitude. He knew they valued the principle of peace and unity as much as he did. He knew they loved God as much as he and his brother did. Edward Hicks was able to advance spiritually, not by rejecting his past, but bringing the best of it into a new, more expanded belief system. So many of us try to deny our old traditions and thus suppress them, but they don't go away. Just like we can't truly deny and separate ourselves fully from who our parents are. Hicks was able to integrate his old belief system into his new creative life. What do I mean by integrate? He was able to understand the value of much of the tradition while understanding it in a new way based on the new person he was growing into, and all without judgment. Now, in order to explain this better, let me segue from this 19th century Quaker folk artist to one of the preeminent philosophers in the world today, Ken Wilbur. That may seem like a long journey, but please bear with me. I've begun reading a book by Wilbur titled The Religion of Tomorrow, subtitled A Vision for the Future of the Great Traditions. More inclusive, more comprehensive, more complete. In that book, he traces the growth stages of people using the ideas of spiral dynamics that we have looked at in some of my past presentations. Remember spiral dynamics, some of you? Well, as a refresher, and for those who haven't yet been exposed to it, it postulates that human beings and whole societies naturally progress through certain stages of understanding, certain stages of interpreting their environment. Each stage has been given a color to simplify it and make it easier to discuss. Let's zero in on the first tier levels of growth, which reflect where our society has been and where it is today. Now, at the bottom is the beige level. This is the mere survival stage, the entirely self-focused stage where all we or our community cares about are its basic needs to survive. But then there's the purple level above it. This is the level where magical thinking develops in order to keep the tribe, the clan safe by appeasing gods. The individual is subsumed to the needs of the clan. And then we're on to the red stage. This is the stage where the individual asserts itself again, breaking free from the constraints of the clan in order to exercise its own power and dominance. Authoritarian figures reveal themselves in tribes and ethnic communities at this stage. Then above it is the blue. This is the stage where the individual again sacrifices him or herself to the transcendent cause or truth. It is usually a stage where spiritual traditions and their myths are interpreted literally. And so fundamentalistic, ethnocentric communities are characteristic of the blue stage. Above that is the orange level. Once again, the individual asserts him or herself, this time using their own faculties of reason to explore their full capacities for growth. This is the era of the Renaissance and Enlightenment, where rational faculties are exalted and where individual achievement and freedom are championed. The idea of God is either dead or is dying at this stage. This is where much of the Western world currently resides. But then above it is the green. Again, the community is valued over the individual. This is the postmodern era where equality of outcome and egalitarianism are sought in order to build stronger and more peaceful global communities. Caring and compassion for others are valued over individual aspirations and achievements. This is where the Western world is currently heading. Now, one thing about all these first tier stages that you see is that they reject all the other stages as wrong, are so confused as to be unworthy of attention. Now, what does this have to do with Edward Hicks, his paintings, and the Quaker schism, and most importantly, us? All the faith traditions start by someone or some group of people having a dramatic, dynamic, life-altering spiritual experience. How that spiritual experience is interpreted depends on what stage of growth they are in at the time. These experiences are then written down, usually by the generation to follow, or sometimes several generations later, and then these writings ultimately develop the status and authority of Holy Scripture. The generations of followers that come afterwards, who have spiritual experiences based on exposure to these scriptures and the rituals and practices that grew out of them, also interpret that experience based on what level of growth they are at the time. Doesn't that make perfect sense? Well, I hope so. Often the founders of religious traditions are actually at a much higher level than the followers that come after. The Orthodox Quakers during Hicks' day were still at the mythic stage. And though they were truly encountering a transcendent spirit through their religion, they were interpreting it based on their growth level. But Edward Hicks was at a different level. I would say a combination of orange and green, and perhaps another. He must have had, I believe, character traits of a higher stage than even green. And I will explain that in a minute. We too interpret profound experiences, whether they are of a spiritual nature or an intellectual or strictly emotional, based on the stage of growth we are at the time of the experience. But what happens to our understanding of that experience when we move to a different level of growth? Do we look back on that experience and dismiss it as youthful ignorance or superstition? We may very well do that. But one thing we can't deny, the experience we once had was real. The trick is to accept the experience as real, but understand it and appropriate it in a new way based on the new person we have become. Sadly, many people don't do this. Religious prejudice, by that I mean prejudice against religious belief, is rampant today, and it primarily comes from people raised within a particular religious tradition. This isn't all that strange, but actually makes a lot of sense. Most of us, once we get to college and beyond, come to believe something different than our early traditions. And too often after college, we reject much of our tradition. We have grown to believe something different, but haven't learned to integrate the positive lessons, experiences, and values that came from our early traditions. Too often, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. Too often, we condemn the hypocrisy of the followers of a particular tradition without noticing we don't live all that better than the ones we condemn. Well, at least I'm not a hypocrite, some of us might say. Yet we are, because we stand in judgment of people we are no better than. I think all of us could learn from the Quakers' belief that the spark of the divine is in all people. William Penn, whom you see here, and the artist who painted him certainly thought so. The admonition, seek first to understand rather than to be understood, often exemplified by Quakers, is an adage meant to heal us. It has nothing to do with the other person or persons we are tempted to judge. Seek first to understand keeps dis-ease away from us. We first must seek to understand ourselves, and in particular, the valuable experiences we had in the past and how to best appropriate them to the person we are ever growing to be. This idea is represented in the second tier of the spiral dynamic stages. So let's briefly look at it. At the yellow level, this is the level of growth, where individuals and communities stop rejecting the stages that came before and try to integrate the best lessons and values and attributes of those stages. It is characterized by a broad perspective of understanding, seeking wisdom of all traditions so that they can enhance our capability of experiencing the transcendent and expanding our growth. Here, the vitality of experiences is valued over material possessions. The turquoise phase above the yellow merely takes this further into a mystical way of being, where all of life is embraced and honored. I believe Edward Hicks must have had a little bit of the second tier stages within him, because he did not completely reject his more orthodox Quaker past, but was able to integrate the best of it into a new way of understanding the Spirit's working in the world. An understanding that the Spirit is not silent, but still speaks, even through art. In this version of the Peaceable Kingdom, our last artwork, on display now at the Denver Art Museum on the second floor, you can see it if you want, if you're in Colorado. In this painting, Hicks has combined the Isaiah 11 vision with a more easily seen William Penn making a treaty with the Native Americans and the Natural Bridge. For me, it completes Hicks's hopeful vision for the Quakers, as well as his own personal experience of the divine spirit. Now look on the right side of the painting at the two figures just above the child in red. See them? Unfortunately, the Denver painting is not in the best condition, but you can see in this close-up, the two figures have now made their way to the peaceable kingdom of animals and the child who had led them. The child many interpret as the Christ. Edward Hicks's art reveals his own journey toward integrating his past tradition into a more expanded tradition in a positive way. I see so many people mistakenly believe they have completely rejected their past traditions, which they see in black and white terms, and rejected them as completely wrong and bad. But just like the home from which we came, we can't fully extract ourselves from those values and teachings. We can suppress them where they can do great harm, usually through projection in which we judge others for exhibiting traits we actually possess buried deep within ourselves. If we are at a new level of growth, why don't we try integrating the best of our past traditions so that we appreciate them and even live in light of them, but in new, more expansive ways? Last week, I asked you if your past was preventing you from taking hold of a new future. Perhaps the solution is not to wholly reject the past, but find ways to bring it with us, yet in a wholly new direction.